I'll now ask Rosemary Richards, our Executive Officer of the MCIA, to come up and chair the next session. Thanks, Rosemary.
Great, thanks Peter, and if I could get my panel to come up as well, hopefully they're all in the room somewhere. Well, thanks very much, and thanks Peter and Hunter for that session. It was really good. Well, welcome everyone, and as you probably expecting from your program, I'm not Reese, and I know we're obviously filling big shoes from Reese, who was down to moderate this panel. But in our very global world that we live today, Reese did go to a wedding in New Zealand, Sally, and came back with COVID. So unfortunately, he's not with us today, and so I'm going to be moderating this panel. So we are going to wing it a little bit because obviously I haven't got the same amount of preparation as Reese did. But what we'd like to do today is do a bit of a walkthrough on the global regulatory world of medical cannabis, and I think we've got some really good experts here to help us with. So on the panel, we're not going to read the bios out. You've all got them on your app, and so you'll see throughout the conference we are going to let you do your own research on the speakers. But really pleased to have Sally King with us from the New Zealand Medicinal Cannabis Council. Sally and I share many of the same challenges in our roles, and it's been great to have some of the collaboration that we've done together. Martin Woodbridge is a consultant to Bedrocan and has a great overview of a number of the parts of the world, so again he can share a lot of our knowledge. Jacob Vogel is at the pointy end of bringing innovations to markets, and so we are going to talk a little bit about innovation and regulation and moving cannabis into the pharma market. So welcome, Jacob. And of course, Hunter, who you've met, who I've co-opted onto the panel to help to help us navigate some of these regulatory challenges. So as I said, we are going to take a quick look at regulation around the globe, and we're all invited to join in the conversation. As you know, you can ask questions through the app, and we also have some roving mics in the room. I think, as we know, our global world is moving towards legal, regulated medicinal cannabis markets, but it is a very complex and evolving space. And certainly for our Australian industry, whilst we are increasing the amount of Australian grown and manufactured products for our market, we're also increasingly interested in looking at exporting to global markets. And Peter mentioned some of that in his opening remarks. But tackling export markets is challenging, given the legalisation of access to medicinal cannabis around the world is an evolving process, and I think Hunter gets touched on some of that. We wrote in a report that Paddy Holmes and I did last year for the Victorian Government. We said medicinal cannabis has undergone a sea change in liberalisation, normalisation and commercialisation, and I think that sort of sums it up really nicely. I think we do see the two broad themes of expansion of legal access to cannabis and a growing acceptance of the plant's therapeutic value, and also the recognition of it as a potential catalyst for economic growth. And again, Hunter's talked about some of that. But it is a challenging space, and I know some of our companies who've tried to, looking at overseas markets is, it's challenged by some of the regulatory changes, and equally some of the countries who are sitting next to me who are looking to access our Australian market are also, I guess, looking to navigate through our regulatory framework. And increasingly, I think there's also interest in global standards and opportunities for harmonisation, and that's one of the issues that we want to touch on today. So Sally, I'm going to start with you and go across the ditch, and perhaps you can just give us an update on the Medicines Act in New Zealand and how industry and patients are looking to view that.
Well, our New Zealand Medicines Act is from the 1980s, 1981 in fact. Couldn't be much older or much less fit for purpose. So in the last year or two, in fact over 15 years, they've been consulting on the matter, or more, isn't it, Reese? But they have recently got to the point of a first reading, and it's in select committee actually next week for just 1 week. So after a huge and long and very prolonged consultation, the process is now on warp speed. and we expect it to go through Select Committee. They are telling us that we will see a New Medicines Act before this government ends its time, which is October this year, which is remarkable. On the good side of that, even if we avoid all the things, there's a lot that's good in the new therapeutic products bill. Lots of opportunities that we've been waiting for as a whole medicines community. But interestingly, misuse of drugs, which is where we are regulated, has been pulled out. That means they're not looking at it. Doesn't mean we're not engaged in it, but it does mean that at the moment, medicinal cannabis is arguably not really part of the new medicines or the therapeutic products bill. But we take a different view in the council about that. We will be presenting to Select Committee next week, and in particular the things that are challenging to us are around CBD, particularly low-dose CBD, but also export and how that operates. So I won't bore you with how, but there's a lot happening, a great deal.
Thanks, Sally. And we were talking about the harmonisation side. I mean, you and I have talked about harmonisation of the low-dose CBD, and I'll want to come to Martin and a minute as well on some of the harmonisation. But just do you want to touch on some of the issues around the differences even between two countries who are so close together, and potentially, we could look at a sort of shared market. We have some differences in the regulations between our two countries.
Yes, we have a harmonisation between New Zealand and Australia for most medicines, but it is a bit particularly challenging. The TGA have approved a pharmacy only or pharmacist only potential for low-dose CBD. And we recently took that to our own medicines classification committee to ask them to harmonise, and they said no. They said no, and their rationale for saying no, with no disrespect to that committee, they had a very full, very, very full agenda. They only meet twice a year at the moment. That will change. But we have sent an objection in, and that objection has been accepted. So we will be relooking at CBD, or the Medicines Classification Committee will be, about August this year, and hopefully that will mean we can align with the TGA's view about low-dose CBD. Now, I might say that this will require a kind of level of studies that we're still working on, but it is a step forward. It's more an indication than it is, a fine result for us, but it's the right direction.
Yeah, I think that, it's quite exciting if we can get the harmonisation. Obviously, our industry welcomed the change that came here. We've probably not yet quite got to the step of having the clinical trial results to get to registration, but it's certainly something I think as an industry we see as a really good step forward, and I think, again, ties into some of what Hunter was talking around in terms of treating these things as real medicines. Martin, we've also had a lot of discussion around harmonisation with some of the work that Bedrocan's been doing around standards, and you've done a lot of work around the US-EU standardisation. Do you want to talk about some of the harmonisation at the standards level?
Sure. Just for clarification, I'm a consultant with Bedrocan, and some of the work that I'm doing outside of Bedrocan relates to what I'll be discussing now. If we look at the bigger picture, the Australia, New Zealand, we prioritise the European pharmacopoeia within the TGA and the regulation of our medicines. The EDQM in the US, in Europe, just in December released a draft monograph for inflorescence, cannabis inflorescence, which stated a plus or minus 10% for the assay. I think this is quite an important point for our countries to consider, given that we are likely, if that is a published monograph, then we are likely to also follow suit in due course. Moreover, the result also is that if companies in this area of the world are to actually actively be in the European space, then it's likely also we will have to have products. We're looking at flower products that meet that monograph standard as well. So these are big, high hurdles to jump. In December, the US Pharmacopoeia and ASTM, which is the American Standards Organization, co-hosted a workshop which looked at cannabis quality, in particular the harmonization between Europe and America. We covered a number of aspects from regulations to standards development, as well as looking at laboratories. And laboratory component was a particularly important one because there are a number of issues which relate to the quality. How do you actually select a sample from your, if we're looking just at cannabis inflorescence at the moment, how do you select your sample? How do you prepare your sample? What methodologies are actually necessary to identify particular quality aspects of that cannabis inflorescence? So all of these topics were covered during that conversation. And it realised that while the US at a federal level are not permitting the use of this as a medicine, it's likely in the future, given the status of discussions within the Biden administration, to progress towards federal regulations permitting the use of these as a medicine. Now, if we are to achieve harmonisation between the two superpowers in terms of economies, then again, that will have influence on what happens in this part of the world and our ability to actually interact in those markets. The next to this is a pitch to let you all know that in May, at the start of May, there will be part 2 of that harmonisation workshop, which will cover all of the aspects we discussed in the first workshop, but also look towards this region, Asia, South Africa, etc., to understand what are going to be the impacts of harmonisation on these different jurisdictions, and more importantly, to get insights and contributions from this part of the world. So again, I will send that invitation out more widely, and I think it's very important that all of you are involved in those discussions. If we look at it more widely and the bigger picture, during 2020 and 2021, the United Nations International Narcotics Control Board held a series of meetings, as well as the development of a global framework for the licensing, monitoring and reporting around cannabis. So licensing, meaning the standardization of licenses, what categories you are able to be licensing in according to the UN Conventions on Drugs. The monitoring by regulatory authorities, and the reporting of that information back to the INCB. Cannabis quality and everything that I just discussed with regards to the USP ASTM Global Workshop really has an impact there, because the ability of our national regulatory authorities to accurately estimate the amount of controlled drugs as cannabis in our country for patient use relies on quality of data, and laboratory aspects here come majorly into play, and the ability for transnational trade also is underlined within that.
Yes, thanks, Martin, and certainly diverging a little bit onto industry metrics and reporting. It's something that's very dear to our heart here, and it's something that we've been working hard with our regulator to try and get some better metrics, and I think globally we would all benefit from that, and measurements is difficult. But Jacob, Israel's also had some issues around harmonisation with the EU. Do you want to make some comments?
Do you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
So before I comment on that, I just want to say that it's very challenging to be a pharmaceutical product in a cannabis world. And we're in Syqe already 10 years, almost 12 years in this pathway. But in the end of the day, when we see the impact that we have on our patients, that means all. So that gives us energy to work and create that future. Israel was very novel with its cannabis scheme. It had what we called an IMC GMP, Israeli Medical Cannabis GMP, because we needed to create one. We didn't have any scheme over there. And now a lot of Israeli companies, licensed producers, when they want to go abroad to Europe, they have a big problem because it's not harmonized with the EU GMP. So currently a lot of those licensed producers basically bringing EU health entities to come and audit them in order to get those licenses. But the industry as itself is working a lot with the European, with the Israeli authorities and the European authorities in order to harmonize it. Because I can tell you that from our aspect, when we bring a GMP product from Holland, Bedrocan, it goes into the factory as a EU GMP, it goes out as an IMCA GMP. Fortunately, in Australia, it's something that we can provide to patients here, but again, we need to come and have an audit, basically from a European country to come and give us that EU GMP, which is in processes. So this is a very big difficulty today for the Israeli industry, licensed producers, but we're working as a whole in order to make this happen and much more easy for the market.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, again, we'll hear some in the session after this, also after morning tea, there's a session around Australia's new changes to TGO 93 and our move towards obviously trying to bring all product into line with Australian GMP standards. But we are very fortunate to have that cooperation agreement around EU GMP, which does help our industries. I will move on in a minute, but Sally, I know you've also been having some conversations with MCIA around harmonisation and some of the issues. Did you want to make any final comments before I maybe change direction a little bit?
No, just to say that it would be a damn good thing. New Zealand is, a pretty close cousin, and I can see few reasons why there would be differences. When our regulations were set, they were set pretty high, and I see that people are mostly rising to that same standard. So it's a bit of an opportunity for us all, really. I see that Australia and New Zealand have a great deal to offer globally, and the harmonisation between the two is essential for that.
Thanks. I'm going to come to Hunter in a minute, but there is a question I think that just relates back to some of the conversation we're having around S3 products coming through. It just says, can each of the panelists, it is to all of the panelists, please share your experience on cannabis-based OTC or S3 products without prescription for wellness purposes available in pharmacies. I don't know who wants to tackle that first. I mean, Hunter, do you want to make a comment on that first? Or?
Sure, happy to. Cannabis products in this wellness category in the U.S. are predominantly CBD products. The Farm Bill, which was passed in 2018, removed hemp, which is, again, a legal definition, not a scientific definition, which allowed these products to be sold from a legal standpoint, but there was no FDA swim lane for these products, so they're not true supplements. The regulations are difficult to enforce. Usually they're enforced by claims or either the quality, but there's no doubt that some patients have received benefits from some of these products. One of the first well-known ones was Charlotte's Web, and that was a little girl, Charlotte, who had epilepsy, who's had some success there. But largely these other products, the CBD dose is very, very low, and I'm not sure that, although people may feel they're helping, that could be placebo, but I'm not convinced that at these very, very low doses that we're getting quite the success that we would get if we really studied where that dose should be in specific indication. They are sold frequently in a lot of different forms. I've seen CBD bath bombs and CBD candles, and people swear those work too. So I think we need some more information to find out what's actually working and what people just think that works.
Does anyone else on the panel want to make any comments on that? Okay. So I was going to move on to a question to Hunter and maybe Jacob, but and I guess it's this question around the challenges that you raised, Jacob, for medicinal cannabis or for a plant-based, and you also mentioned, Hunter, a broad-based plant-based medicine. moving into more of a pharmaceutical or registration. And our minister this morning was obviously encouraging the industry to move down that way for registration, and obviously cost. We all know for patients that cost is one of the major issues, and one way to bring that cost down is to get it onto our pharmaceutical benefits scheme, but we do need registered products for that, and I think that there are challenges for medicinal cannabis products and how we move down that pathway. Do you want to make any comments around that? And I might come to Jacob.
Sure. The U.S. is not. We have these state laws, and it's been difficult to navigate this from a state regulatory manner, and then with the Controlled Substance Act removing hemp, again, more difficult. But one thing that has been a benefit, and recently the FDA has come out with an announcement delineating that there's support for research. And in fact, it's not, if you meet certain requirements, it's not difficult to do research in patients with cannabis products in the U.S. There is a requirement for what would be the equivalent of GMP 110, 111, which is basically food level GMP to do early phase studies. So they're not requiring full pharmaceutical GMP to do these early studies. I think it's a way you can get ideas about safety and PK under physician supervision before you have this burdensome full-blown pharma. The hope is once you establish that information, you will have investment. I believe if you have something that works like we believe that it works, and you have data to support that, people will invest. I mean, there was certainly investment with Epidiolex, and I certainly expect that if you have a drug that is safe and treats disease in small studies, I think you'll get that investment. And that's probably the most clear but expensive and onerous pathway to go right now.
Jacob?
From our end, basically we always look at it as a dual strategy. So we have the existing medical cannabis scheme that today we can provide our solutions to patients. We started in the beginning with the clinical trial, of course, understanding exactly what we have, what is the low dose of THC actually do to patients, create those clinical guidelines, situation guidelines that you talked about, Hunter. But in parallel, we also believe that in the end of the day, our technology is enabled to bring flower inhalation to a pharmaceutical grade, where basically a physician knows exactly what is prescribing, what is in the aerosol, not just in the flower itself. So we're topping it another level up. And we always are running in this parallel. So the pharmaceutical challenge, of course, that's something that's a long-term strategic experiment for us, 5 years, a lot of investment that needs to be over there. But if we can help patients tomorrow morning with the regular cannabis schemes, that's where we also want to be. You just mentioned about the reimbursement. So because Syqe Air is basically a combined device, so it's a medical device from one end and have the cannabis from the other end. Every country that we enter, we basically registers the device as a medical device. So we have a CE approved, we have a Canadian MDL. In Australia, we also submitted it to the ARTG as a class 2. Hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll get that approved. So that will take some of the load off the patients. But we do believe that in the end of the day, because it's a pharmaceutical product, still governments and HMOs needs to reimburse those kind of treatments. I can tell you from Israel, where HMOs, large HMOs, didn't even want to talk or see about cannabis. We have today in Israel an HMO that subsidizes Syqe to endometriosis women suffering from pain. So it's starting to get there. We also have the reimbursement. We just had an agreement with the Israeli Minister of Defense to provide all the inhaler to all its veterans. So mainly chronic pain, mainly PTSD. It's going to get there. Hopefully when we have a final pharmaceutical product that is FDA approved, that will open the door for many more patients.
And so, Martin, yeah, sure.
I do believe that inhalation is here to stay, and that cannabis inflorescence can be a true pharmaceutical. Bedrocan has 20 years of data to show that batch-to-batch consistency in that plant material. And I think that's critical to the success of Syqe Medical as well, and their ability to be able to take that plant material and have assurance that when that's being put into a very sophisticated inhalatory device, that they are able to actually release an active ingredient from a consistent plant source.
Sally, do you see the same pressures towards registration in New Zealand with legislation there? Do you see the same sort of move towards the government looking for more products through the registration system in New Zealand? Is that
Not yet. Not yet. But look, I do think that we're on the trajectory, as it were. We're a pretty small place, New Zealand, and our medicinal cannabis agencies, 2 or 3 people. So the capacity isn't quite there right now. But it's not that no one's willing. It's a question of timing, really, and we'll be joining you. We're just not there yet.
We do have a sort of question on the app coming through, which I'm not sure any of the panel might want to try and answer, but I'll ask it anyway. What is the cost impact for the public health system if more medical cannabis became registered as a pharmaceutical drugs on the ARTG? I think that's a policy question for the government, but Martin, do you?
Well, it's my understanding that in order for so if it's on the ARTG, that's a success, and that's a very big positive. But in order for it to become a subsidised medicine, whether in New Zealand or Australia, it's my understanding that that medicine must be compared to an equal medicine and be seen to be of greater therapeutic value, preferably also at a cheaper price. So there's a high hurdle for cannabis to jump, but as you have accurately discussed earlier on, there's the importance of data to be able to actually get up to there is what we actually need. And so while it can be on the RTG, the data in order for it to be able to compare against other drugs is what's lacking at the moment.
Yeah. I could just comment from some of the health outcome data from the Epidiolex studies. It's kind of a similar situation. Given that it was an add-on treatment in a catastrophic condition where these patients spend often hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on hospitalizations for status, imaging, EKG, EEG. There's quite a big cost burden for those patients, and it was pretty clear in the data from the outcomes of the studies that the overall cost burden was decreased. It's important to note that this can be very disease-specific. Pediatric epilepsy, where patients are refractory to treatments, is probably a lot different than the cost outcomes for something like osteoarthritis. So if you're developing something and when you want to utilize that argument, it's probably better suited for patients where you have this kind of catastrophic unmet need rather than something that is still bad but maybe not as severe.
Thanks.
One further thought is that it's possible, and I'm hopeful, that the health economics will see insurers think very differently about this area. I know that some good research is being done at the moment just on this subject here in Australia, where insurers will be looking ahead of others that they can see the economic benefits for their communities. And that's not to suggest that these things won't be safe. It's just to suggest that the broader economics just are perhaps not quite the thing that our government or our Medicinal Cannabis Agency will be looking at directly. They will be looking at the health benefit, but not necessarily the broader economic benefit.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, and it's something as MCIA we've been trying to, put forward that the benefits to the medicinal cannabis industry are very broad, and there's benefits to the health system, there's benefits to in our case, regional Australia, with some of the jobs and developments in regional Australia, so there's economic benefits. Obviously, trade benefits if we can get the export settings right for us to be able to export to other markets. So, understanding that whole broad economic benefit of medicinal cannabis is really important. Jacob and then Hunter.
I'll just add to that one of the most frustrating thing about the cannabis medicine is that Usually it's an out-of-pocket market, except Germany. No one really reimburses, or special communities, special like the veterans. And with pain patients, when you need to set those expectations about pain and the goals and what you need to do, when you treat with cannabis, you also need to have those setting expectations regarding pricing, because patients do not understand that it's out-of-pocket treatment, and they have to understand where it goes. So it's also very challenging for the patients.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's also, a challenge, again, on one of Hunter's comments, being able to shift that big patient basis from the illicit market into the medicinal market, so we can provide the quality, safe products is part of that challenge as a cost. Hunter?
Yeah, and I would just add that there's probably another layer to the payer and health outcome data component, and that would be the legal ramifications. And it likely varies by region, but is there a liability if a payer, whether it's a government or an insurance agency, is covering the cost for something that hasn't been approved by the regulatory body? Even if we see, like in the U.S., we've seen decrease in opioid use in states where cannabis is legal. I think the economic burden for insurance companies of people going to rehab and hospitalized for that is certainly a net positive financially. But if they were to open a scheme where they cover this cost and something bad happens, are they open for lawsuits, which is a class action lawsuit in the U.S. If you watch TV, it's like every 5 minutes, do you want to sue these people? So there's this, I think, big risk thing going on in the background.
Yeah, we hope we don't go down the US path, but
Yeah.
now we do have another question coming through the app, and obviously great to see you putting questions through the app, and you're doing points for that if you're playing the game, so that's great. But you can also stand up and ask the question if you want to join in. And there is a roving mic going around if anyone does want to ask a question. I've got a spotlight right in my eyes, so I can't see you, but Meredith will see you. But Martin, there's a question there for you that you mentioned, talked about laboratory variation. Do you have any idea of the standard deviation within the lab and between labs is for assay?
What kind of a question? Goodness me. We do know the importance of lab to lab, the importance of ensuring that we have eliminate variation between labs, and there's well tried and true processes for achieving that. I think what underlines, and I can't give an exact discussion answer to that, but what underlines that is actually what methodologies we're using. Are labs actually regulatory? Are the regulatory control over labs sufficient enough to actually control them? And I think the US is a really good example. And this was discussed during the December workshop. There is a lack of regulatory control about what sampling occurs, how sampling occurs, what is the sample, is it from the top of the plant, is it from the bottom, or is it homogenized? Is the actual preparation of that sample, again, according to a strict regulatory requirement? These are the problems that we're facing across the whole of the globe, and hence why it was such a big topic of discussion at that meeting. And again, will be brought up during the May meeting. So I encourage whoever that was to come along and be a part of that discussion in May.
Can you speak to testing in triplicate, or if we're just doing single testing? Do you have an opinion on that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
I'm convoluted myself.
I have no opinion on that, other than testing should occur according to appropriate methodologies that have been shown through validation to provide a consistent outcome. I think that's what underlines everything, whether you do it in a singular or triplicate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Okay, changing tact a little bit here, Sally, a question for you. And this is obviously a major issue for us in Australia, and will be touched on a bit tomorrow when we have some speakers tomorrow around this. But to Sally, how is driving a vehicle being dealt with in the New Zealand regulations?
Not terribly well. And the problem is that about a year ago or more now, a proposal was put and agreed in our government that impairment would be measured at roadside. But unfortunately, there are no tests that actually do this. So just the other day, the tests that, well, they've postponed. They've simply postponed. Our problem is, of course, that evidence of cannabis in your system is not evidence of impairment. We did not get that past the select committee or the legislation, I'm sorry to say, but that's pretty consistent with what happened in Australia too. The one thing I can say at the moment is, though, that they're not testing for it because they don't have the right kind of testing equipment, that they can evidence it anyhow. So we're back where we were for now.
Yeah, no, look, it's certainly a really big issue, and certainly for us, you know, the issue between detection and impairment is critical, and obviously there's a lot of debate at the moment going on here in Australia around it, and I think Nathan will talk tomorrow around Drive Change, which is a campaign here in Australia that we're trying to push very hard to get some change on the regulations. I don't know if it's the same.
Well, there's good. Any medicine that impairs needs to be taken into consideration about, are you operating a vehicle or machinery, and that's across whether you're taking cannabinoids or opioids or whatever drug substance you may be prescribed. There's good data, I know, from the Lambert Initiative, the PhD.
John Arnold.
I've forgotten his name, my apologies, but you know, this is critical information that we really should be relying on in that regard.
Yeah, so we will have a couple of sessions tomorrow. Fiona Patton, who's put that question through, will be speaking tomorrow, but also we do have someone from Swinburne University talking about some policy initiatives as well, so encourage you all, if you're interested in driving, to come back tomorrow for those conversations. Is it an issue in Israel as well, Jacob?
It's a very big issue, but in the end of the day, patients drive with their cannabis. There's no real testing like in Australia. There is trying to have a regulation that will put at least a threshold of you can't drive if you have more than 5 nanogram ml in the blood level. It's supposed to kick in the next couple of months, and then based on that, they'll be able to say, okay, this is the threshold, underneath that you can drive. But again, until you have those tests that tell you what is the dose that you need to, that will basically have your cognitive impairment, that's exactly what's the clinical trials that are needed in order to understand, like they did with alcohol and any other drug over there. So that's it, sir.
And Sally, New Zealand's, oh sorry.
Well, I think this is a huge dilemma, and it's going to be very difficult to solve, because the correlation between plasma volume, possibly CNS exposure, and driving outcomes is very different between individuals, just like probably therapeutic windows. Certain people are extremely sensitive to THC, and they may fall well below that level and have some serious impairment. They also may not want to drive because they're paranoid. But I don't foresee probably the best way, which regulators I don't think will ever agree upon, is to measure intoxication rather than actual levels. Like that's not a sufficient biomarker to determine if there's impairment. We have those data with alcohol, but there was actually a test that we did for Sativex where driving improved in Germany with the addition of Sativex with MS patients. So it's a difficult situation, and I don't know how it's going to be solved by looking at plasma levels or even in exhalation type methods or eye tracking and those sorts of things. I think there needs to be more creative about this. It's not alcohol. It's just not.
By the way, that's a whole different indication that you said now. Sativex for bringing driving your skills better, to have better skills. I'll give it to my mother, I think.
Yes, what?
Could I just, in the last 3 minutes, I realise you've probably got some other questions, but can I just raise what I think is one of the critical issues that the industry is facing as we progress? I've been coming to Australia in this field since 2016. Now, at that time, cannabis became available for patient use. and there were throughout the country. And we are now, as an industry, facing the potential that, New South Wales ACT are going to permit the recreational use of cannabis. And that's going to have major impacts on the long-term validity of this industry. And I think it's important that industry actually informing regulators and policymakers about what impact that will have on patients, because we've seen it in numerous countries where it's a drive to the bottom in terms of quality, that patients move to a recreational setting to secure their medicines, and there's the actual growth agenda of the recreational industry is far different than what is happening in this space, and it's a very patient-focused space. So these are some massive issues that are going to face the industry, and we've already seen the ramifications of those regulatory changes in Canada, which started out as a relatively normal medical system. Thailand is another example where they started out with an incredibly robust, medical-focused and high-quality medicine industry, and now has been infiltrated with coffee shops, much like the Netherlands.
It's actually even worse in Canada now because you can't actually do the research. You can do organoleptic testing. It's recreational, so I can give a patient a THC beverage and ask them, do they like the flavor? But if I wanted to analyze, some sort of cannabinoid product, in most cases, in a clinical trial, under physician supervision, you basically can't do it unless you have the whole regulatory packet or at least the initial preclinical toxin safety data to put it in as a pharmaceutical drug. So in some cases, the recreational market kills research, and it really killed the research in Canada.
And I think that's a question that I was going to ask, and also came up on the screen as where I want to go in the last few seconds that we've got, is really around the research. I mean, we do have some major inhibitors to being able to undertake research here in Australia because of our scheduling. Is that the same in other jurisdictions? Is that the same for you at Hunter?
It's gotten better in the U.S. I mean, we still have Schedule 1, so the opposite of your schedule. But so it does require a DEA registration for drug-type cannabis, but for hemp-type cannabis, so 0.3% or less, agency seems very supportive. Some hurdles, but better now than it was before. Certainly better than Schedule 1 Epidiolex when I started, way better. So the agency has gotten more supportive as we continue to push the research envelope.
And what about Israel's obviously a leader in research in this capacity, but do you have hurdles as well?
Everything in cannabis has hurdles. There's average human time and there's cannabis time. It's 3 times more. There's accelerated access for clinical trials, but still it's hard. But in the end, we can do clinical trials for all the time. Investigating, and that's where the R&D comes from in the end of the day. Because we need those clinical trials.
Well, thank you. Well, I can see we're over time, and as the fill-in chair or moderator, I don't want to be the first one to run out as the organiser. I don't want to be the first one to run us out over time, so I will call a call to the end of the panel. But look, thank you very much. I think we could have talked for a lot longer. Obviously, we have a morning tea break now, so hopefully people who didn't get their questions answered can come and talk to you in the break. But to all of you, thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time and for making your way to Australia, and hope you enjoy your time here. But thank you very much.